this class in the classroom. One night I surprised the class and say, everybody up! And we all go looking for Quaraintine Road on the campus. Well, for my online students, while we can't maybe surprise you, I can still talk to you a little bit about Quaraintine Road and the aspect of quarantine in history, and specifically in the 18th and 19th century here in Norfolk, Virginia. There's lots for you to read about Quaraintine, so my little film is just meant to be an adjunct aspect of the reading that goes along with Quaraintine. Quarantine has been practiced since time out of mind, perhaps, and since we're living it now, or at least I am right now in the month of May, in terms of COVID-19, I wanted you to be able to reflect on how people in the past experienced quarantine and the way you're experiencing sheltering in place today. So, quarantine, it's in the Bible, it's in lots of ancient texts, goes back in time to even before people understood about microbes, germs, viruses. Long before that, peoples understood in various cultures around the world that when a disease outbreak occurs, if you separate people and put the sick away from the healthy, then you can curb the spread of the disease. So quarantine, we're aware of it being practiced by the ancient Romans. Certainly during the outbreak of bubonic plague in the 14th century, we read about quarantine. And here in the United States, by 1700, most port cities had some sort of quarantine station where ships would pull up to the docks, a quarantine officer would get out, communicate with the captain of the ship, and determine whether there was illness on board and whether the ship and perhaps individuals on the ship needed to be quarantined. Here in Norfolk, there were two quarantine stations. One was a station down this road off Lambert's Point, where ships would pull up, and between a certain number of buoys, they would dock and communicate with the quarantine station officers. And perhaps then they'd be let to go on their way to other wharfs and whatever in ports to unload their goods. Or if it was determined that there was sickness on board, those ships might stay there, or they might end up off the coast, really up here in what is today Larchmont, in not too far from the ODU campus, close to Tanner's Creek. There was a quarantine house in that direction. The quarantine station just held officers. The quarantine house held sick people. And I'm fascinated by this history. I'm fascinated by this story. There's not a lot of documentation. Generally, quarantine houses were not where you wanted to be. The rich often got out of quarantine while the poor were placed there. And in the history of Norfolk, in the 18th and 19th century, there's also a lot of imprecision in terms of knowing what actually happened to slaves. Were slaves quarantined in that house? Were they quarantined separately? Free blacks as well. But at the same time, we know that whatever the situation, quarantine was terrible. People would be placed there with different kinds of illnesses: smallpox, measles, yellow fever, many different kinds of diseases. And so people could potentially get sicker in quarantine house and die there. So on this little tour, I'm going to take you down to what was the quarantine station, which is off Ghent in Norfolk today, and then I'm going to take you close to where the quarantine house was. We're studying the unit on yellow fever in this class, where in 1855 a virus caused by a mosquito did horrific damage to the city, really ending its economic growth and killing 2,000 people in Norfolk alone, 3,000 people in Norfolk and Portsmouth, and probably a lot more than that. So many people fled the city. The Civil War broke out soon thereafter, and so in fact it was devastating to the city. And we'll be studying the specifics of yellow fever, the causes and consequences in this course. But for today, this is all about discovering history. As a historian, this is the part that, even though the story is sad, this is the part that I really love, and that's retracing the steps of people that lived in the past, and thinking about how their world and our world can intersect at times. They knew that breaking quarantine could spread disease throughout the city. That's exactly what happened in 1855. And so there are lessons there for us to consider today as well. So thank you. There's going to be 2 more stops on this tour, and I'll catch you later down by the docks. I'm standing on the other side of Webb Center, close to the Dean Fine and Performing Arts building, across from Quaraintine Road over there. And it's just about this point where in the 19th century, Bowden's Ferry Road and Quaraintine Road came together and then shot off in the direction behind Webb Center, where we were earlier at the Quaraintine sign, and then took off into Lambert's Point over down towards the docks. On our tour of Norfolk and Quaraintine Road, if we were to cut through Lambert's Point and head down towards the docks, here around Orpex and Olney, down at the docks, you would have found a quarantine station back in the 19th century. And at that quarantine station, the ships would have pulled up, the officers would have gotten out, and there would have been an inspection of the ship. Okay, sailors of the 19th century had a really difficult time. Generally speaking, they were considered pretty ill most of the time. And so in the 19th century, some Protestant mission organizations got together and founded what was called a Seamen's Friends Home. And basically, they tried to keep sailors off the streets and out of the bars and brothels and things like that. And this is the site of the Seamen's Friends Home, and it was here until fairly recently. So I thought I'd end up near the docks with the quarantine station, and now we'll head out to where the quarantine house was. Here we are on Eleanor Court and Powhatan Avenue. Now Powhatan runs behind the ODU campus, and it was essentially part of Quaraintine Road. It ended up down here at what is now Eleanor Court, and out that way is the water. So the quarantine house was on the water. Ships could pull up there, but normally people were taken probably by cart to Quaraintine House. And again, the conditions there were horrific because people were there with multiple kinds of illnesses. And they may have, if they weren't so sick when they were first put there, they could get sick while they were there. So nobody liked Quaraintine House, nobody wanted to be there. And it was a really awful experience. So this is the end of our trip. Eleanor Court in Larchmont, Quaraintine Road in that direction, ODU down that way, and we have traveled the route of Quaraintine Road in Norfolk, Virginia.